There we go. Hi, my name is Maddie. I'm the host of Respect My Region's Higher Women podcast, where we talk to influential women in the cannabis, psychedelic, and music spaces. On today's show, we have the pleasure of speaking with Shelby Hartman, who is the co-founder of DoubleBlind Magazine. Hi, Shelby. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm just chilling over here in Florida. It's pretty hot out today, and I had to re-get my ID, but now I'm chilling and talking to you, so it's a lot of a better day, I think.
Great.
So, what influenced you to get into journalism?
I've always been a writer. I have journals going back to when I was literally 5 years old, and the only meaningful thing I had to say was like what my favorite color was and what my favorite animal was. Um, I also just always really loved traveling. I always really loved speaking to many different kinds of people. I took a journalism class in college and I enjoyed it. And I was like, this seems like a cool thing to do.
So luckily you found out like what you wanted to do like pretty early in life. Like you were just like I'm gonna be a writer, and you stuck to it, and
Pretty
that's dope.
much.
And that's dope. So, what is Double Blind, and where'd you get the name?
DoubleBlind is a media company covering all things pertaining to the psychedelic movement. So we have a physical print magazine that is in bookstores across the US and ships worldwide that comes out twice a year. And we also publish articles on our website, and we have a YouTube channel, and we cover psychedelic drug development, what's happening in the realm of policy reform, indigenous use of plant medicines. So basically anything that relates to psychedelics. The name comes from the double-blind randomized clinical trial, which is sort of the gold standard in science that is, quote, legitimizing psychedelics in the eyes of the Western medical community. And a lot of people think it's a nod to our reverence for science. It is in a way, but it's also sort of for people who really understand how psychedelic clinical trials work. It's also sort of a reference to the limitations of studying a psychedelic compound in a very sort of specific context, because for anyone who's done a psychedelic before, they know that these are deeply dimensional compounds. Oftentimes they inspire mystical experiences, and there is something sort of absurd in our opinion about trying to squeeze these very dimensional compounds into a very rigid scientific model.
Yeah, and it's super cool to see psychedelics come up like as of recent, like in the recent years, like being legalized in certain states. Do you see any like kind of problems within legalization? You just said it's kind of like putting it in a rigid spot with all of these other already prescription pills. Like what kind of problems do you see psychedelics running into with legality?
It really sort of depends on the model with which psychedelics are legalized. And there are a lot of different routes to decriminalization and or legalization that are being explored simultaneously right now. So the first is what I already referenced, which is the FDA approval model. And it's essentially, a drug development company takes the psychedelic or a psychedelic compound of some kind, and they raise many, many millions of dollars, and then they research this compound, and then they legalize it as a federally approved medicine that has to be prescribed by your doctor and administered in a very particular clinical context, probably with two therapists while you're lying on a couch with a blindfold on. So the limitations or potential problems with that model are that the FDA requires that a patient has an indication. So that means that if psilocybin is approved for major depressive disorder or treatment-resistant depression, which is what it's being investigated for right now, then anybody who has anything else that psilocybin is also shown promise for, whether it's alcohol dependence, nicotine addiction, an eating disorder, they may not have access to psilocybin through their doctor. Or if they do have access, it may end up being exorbitantly expensive because it won't be covered by insurance. That doesn't even take into account all the many, many millions of people who in the psychedelic community we sometimes refer to as, quote, healthy normals. We prefer the term double-blind, undiagnosed people. But essentially what we're doing in the Western medical community, in the mental health community, is for a long time we've sort of created this false dichotomy between people who have mental health problems and thus might need access to psychedelics and everybody else, when we actually know that that's not true, and that there is something valid to be said about, quote, the betterment of well people, right? Like, what about everyone else who just wants to do a psychedelic to explore their own consciousness for spiritual reasons? So those would be some of the limitations of the drug development process. And then we can get into like all the different models of legalization and those limitations as well. But the other primary one is that's sort of moving ahead right now is decriminalization on the local level. We've seen more than a dozen jurisdictions at this point decriminalize psychedelics. And, the benefit of that would be that, we believe at DoubleBlind, no one should be incarcerated for the possession of a drug. And with decriminalization comes the ability to grow your own medicine, which can increase accessibility. You don't need to be diagnosed with depression to grow mushrooms in your house in a decriminalized county. At the same time, it doesn't come with the kind of support that some people might want. Some people might not want to just grow their own mushrooms and trip at their house. Some people might only want to do something in the context of like having a therapist who's there to support them, who's there to help them prepare and integrate their experience when it's over. So I would say that like, hopefully all of these models are going to be working in unison. There are limitations to all of them.
Yeah, because especially like you're totally making me think as you're talking. I'm thinking too about like the cannabis industry and how that's kind of in an interesting way too, because they don't really tell you, this is your prescription amount, per, you have this and you have this and you have this. It's kind of a personal understanding, and there's like other tech that kind of can help you understand how to like dose yourself properly. That is a really interesting thing to think about, how people would go about, getting administered psychedelics if they've never really interacted with it before. Because coming from like a spot of like where you hear about psychedelics without legalization or without decriminalization, and you're just like knowing from like reading and stuff how like sacred and important it is, and to just kind of think like, oh, there's just like people that aren't getting educated, interested in trying it and doing it under without that supervision or without that research. It can definitely make them kind of understand the tool a little bit, not in the right ways. So it is interesting to think about how like those concepts that you described would like be integrated into kind of that program. But I guess it goes back to like psychology and just kind of understanding that there is no one size fits all, right, for anybody, and that it's really going to take some like figuring out to see how we can like make sure that people are having like really good experiences, and making sure that they like are fully understanding what's happening and like what to take from it. But it's really cool. I love talking about psychedelics. It's really cool that you can like there's jobs out there. Did you ever think that you'd be in psychedelics as a career?
I mean, I don't think I would have guessed that I was going to be working in psychedelics when I got my first internship at CBS News when I was like 20, but it's not that surprising because I've been tripping since I was 18. I majored in philosophy. I've been smoking weed since I was 15. I'm also a musician. I come from a family of like psychedelic Jewish musicians. So it's not, it's not like
it's not out of the park for you.
Wasn't totally out of the realm of possibility. But I think, when I was first graduating from school, the psychedelic industry wasn't a thing yet. Many states, including California, hadn't even legalized cannabis.
Yeah, it is crazy. Do you see like, because I know you go to a lot of conventions, do you see like a lot of the people that are fighting for like psychedelic decriminalization and like steps towards that also in the same boat as people that are fighting for cannabis legalization? Or do you see those as like two separate parties fighting hard for the same, or fighting hard for their kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's definitely a lot of overlap between people who are passionate about cannabis and people who are passionate about psychedelics. And what I would
Right.
say is that, at DoubleBlind, we often like to kind of reframe this cannabis psychedelics dichotomy and say that actually it's all just plant medicine. and, you could even include, for example, like functional herbs and mushrooms like lion's mane or turmeric. Like all of that, I think, can be included in this conversation, because really it's about who are the authorities of wellness in our society and what does it mean to put a plant or a mushroom versus a pill into our bodies.
Right.
So I think that a lot of people share that perspective, and I also think that a lot of people who who are passionate about psychedelics started by smoking weed, just like me. Like when I was 15, I smoked weed at summer camp for the first time. When I was 18, I did a psychedelic for the first time. I still use cannabis regularly in my spiritual practice when I'm doing yoga, when I'm meditating, as a way to sort of drop in with myself. That being said, I would say that the cannabis and psychedelic communities are kind of like Venn diagrams, in as much as like there is overlap, but there are also people who are just working on psychedelics who aren't really paying attention to cannabis, and vice versa.
That's cool. What would you say like is the biggest boundary that you face within social media and kind of like being for plant medicine? And obviously, it's not, you know what I mean, the FDA approved. So, what kind of hurdles have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, we've faced huge hurdles on third-party platforms, not only Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and YouTube, but also Google. In
Mm.
December of 2020, DoubleBlind, along with every other psychedelic media site out there, lost 50% of their traffic overnight. Something that SEOs, search engine optimization experts, are referring to as the quote medic update, where essentially
Mm.
Google started prioritizing rehab sites, addiction sites, other sites that sort of are following this age-old dare narrative. Like rather than telling you how to use the drug or how to do the drug safely, they're just saying don't do the drug.
Right.
So we've been up against that. We've also had our Instagram shut down a couple of times. We were kicked off of, we had our Facebook ads manager was wiped of all of its data, and we had to start from scratch. We've had multiple YouTube videos taken down. We've had TikTok videos taken down. We've even been kicked off of payment platforms. Like we were kicked off of PayPal, and they took, I think we had like $2,000 or $3,000 in our account. Literally all money made completely legitimately from people buying magazines, and they just took the money from us as like a penalty for violating their acceptable use policy, even though they never told us exactly what we did wrong. And that's the thing that's really most frustrating about these third-party platforms, is that they're such corporate Goliaths that they don't really have to support you, and they don't really have to give you any meaningful information. Essentially, like they can decide to just shut you down or take away your followers or take away your money, and they're going to continue to succeed and thrive because they have millions and millions and millions of people on their platform who rely on their platform. And we do
Right.
too. Like we've talked about, and other people in the psychedelic and cannabis industries have talked about starting like some kind of Instagram competitor that doesn't censor us. But the thing is that as a business, you're not only speaking to the people that are already in your community, but you're always trying to reach new people.
Right.
And so these platforms that have like the most amount of people on them are the most valuable to us from that perspective. Like you can't
Yeah.
really go start another Instagram. That's not like a realistic thing to try to do.
Yeah, because it would just kind of create like a micro community, and like you said, it's hard to bring in new members if the whole, you know, thing is kind of a label of like no censorship, but it's obviously, you know, certain groups of people are going to use it for the reason of no censorship. And I've seen lately a lot of apps have been started, but it's just, you know, it's one of those things, it's really hard to create a TikTok or something like that. It's really hard to create an app that's going to come in and completely rechange the way that we interact with social media. So it really is that in order to be in this plant medicine, this side of plant medicine, like you really have to be tough, and you really have to like be able to take a lot of punches in order to be able to put your passions out there, which is unfortunate, but we're trying to, and your magazine, I think, like the more information there is about it, the less stigmatized it can be, and the more, change can happen for a lot of people. And like you said, like there's not it's not just people that are, affected and need, something to help them come back. It's also well people like opening their mind too. Like I'm also someone that likes psychedelics, and I also believe that like they can really help you figure things out. And like there's so many good things about psychedelics that if within the right like environment, you can really thrive and learn so many things about yourself. What would you say is like the best environment to have like a psychedelic trip in for you?
I don't know that there's a best environment. I mean, a not good environment would be like a party or somewhere where there's a lot of people that I have to interact with. For me, psychedelics are really tools for going inward. They've never been recreational, and I don't, we often say at Double Blind, we're not trying to create a hierarchy of set and setting. What I mean by that is if someone wants to like go do MDMA and dance all night at a rave, or they want to go into the desert and do mushrooms with their friends, like more power to you. There's no judgment. But for me, like I've dealt with a lot of mental health stuff my whole life that probably goes way back to my ancestors and being Jewish and a lot of stuff that we don't have time to get into. But the point is that I need to be in a container, and I know this about myself, where no matter what emerges, like whether I want to take off my clothes or I want to scream or I want to cry or I want to laugh hysterically, I can do that, and I can feel safe to do that. And so that typically looks like tripping with a really good friend or two who I know are like also wanting to go inward and down to hold space for whatever emerges, or doing psychedelics and ceremony, like in an ayahuasca ceremony where there's trained facilitators, curanderos, curanderas, who can hold space for that as well and help me move through it.
Oh, so you sound like you've done an ayahuasca trip. How was that? If you can go into it.
I mean, it's very intense. I've been doing ayahuasca since I was 25. I'm 32 now. And I've done it in underground circles in the United States, as well as I went to the Amazon in February of 2020 to a all women's ayahuasca retreat at the Temple of the Way of Light outside of Iquitos, Peru. And, you know, just like with other psychedelics, every single trip is different. Every single person is different. It's totally dependent on where you're at in your life, the intention that you bring into it. And then also, obviously, the setting does matter a lot. And there's a huge difference in terms of how various facilitators hold space. And so when I was in the Amazon, we had 7 Shipibo Maestra elders who were there holding space for us, and it was very traditional, and they were blowing mapacho, which is tobacco smoke, into the space, and they were singing Icaro, which are these traditional songs that are intended to help the medicine kind of move through you. I've also gone to ceremonies with, Americans who are just playing music on guitar and singing. I've gone to ceremonies with men and women. I've gone to ceremonies with just women. So it really, really depends on just the environment and the situation.
Yeah, I feel that. I've had a couple different types of trips, and I like to label them like this was the girls' trip, and this was the, you know what I mean, the couples trip, and different things like that. What for you, like how do you like to consume mushrooms? Are you more of like a tea person, or are you just like a raw kind of gal?
Actually, I've never made mushroom tea before, or actually drank mushroom tea before, which is hilarious because the video of me showing people how to make mushroom tea on YouTube has like so many views. I don't know how many. But I would like to try making mushroom, or I would like to try drinking mushroom tea, simply because I think that there's a beauty to the ceremonial aspect of it. And also sometimes mushrooms do make me nauseous, and I've heard that drinking it in tea can help with nausea. But in the past, I have just eaten them whole, or I've eaten them in chocolates.
Facts. I like the peanut butter sandwich method personally. Think it works. Back to journalism. What was one of your faces? You said you've been to Peru, and I also stalked your Instagram a little bit. I saw you in New Orleans for a little bit. What's been your favorite place to travel to?
My favorite place to travel to. I mean, I often say my favorite places have been New Orleans, Burning Man, and Jerusalem, um,
Hmm.
simply because all three of these places have a deep spirit to them.
Hmm.
I also really love Santa Fe, New Mexico. I like places where when you land, it feels, or when you arrive, it feels like there's sort of like an energy or a history that lives in the earth.
Hmm.
I also like places that move more slowly because I have a pretty crazy work ethic, which I definitely inherited from my overworking Jewish parents. And so for me, just to be in like New Orleans, which is very influenced by Haitian culture and the Caribbean, or to be, I don't know, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, also moves more slowly. It really
Hmm.
helps me because I feel like the culture sort of infiltrates my nervous system and helps me to slow down.
No, that totally makes sense. Like I find myself kind of in a similar state, but I'm in Orlando. It's kind of fast over here a little bit. But it's not fast in the way that's like I see people working all the time. It's just that people are constantly busy like doing like, what they're doing, I feel like. But that's cool. I like a slow place. I've never really thought about it like that. I like that. What is your favorite thing about your career being a writer? And actually, you do so many things. You're also a vocalist. You do jazz music too. So, what's your favorite thing about living life and living this lifestyle that you do?
Um, I don't know. I mean, these days I'm just really loving my house, which you can see behind me. It was built in 1904. I have a really cute puppy that I spend a lot of time with. And, I spent a lot of my 20s just backpacking all over the world and reporting and meeting people and never knowing where I was going to end up. And that was really fun. But I'm sort of in this place right now of nesting because I've grown a lot and I'm grateful for how far that I've come, but I also realize that, the journey never ends and I still have a lot that I want to work through internally and I don't have to go anywhere to do that. And
Hmm.
actually it's really helpful to have a home and to have a meditation pillow and to have a garden where I can do yoga and my parents are nearby and I have my dog. Like in terms of the work itself, I'm grateful to be able to work with the people on the double blind team, beautiful, beautiful human beings who work with double blind. And I'm grateful for all the interesting people that I've gotten to meet and do meet through my work. I've been invited to do psychedelics all over the world by really cool, interesting people. And I look forward to like coming out of my nest and being ready to do that at some point. So we'll see. It's a challenge running a media company and a magazine. I'm not going to lie, it comes with a lot of stress, but I'm also very blessed.
Yeah, and speaking of double blind, and that sounds awesome, by the way. I love talking about the things that we love about life. Speaking of double blind, your co-founder Madison, how did you meet her?
So we went to Columbia Journalism School at the same time. We both got our master's in journalism there, but we didn't actually know each other when we were at the journalism school. We we were covering similar things. She was writing about cannabis, but we were in different programs. And then a couple years later, I was living in LA. We were both working as cannabis columnists at LA Weekly. And I needed to interview someone for a story. And I reached out to her dad, Bruce Margolin, who's kind of this pioneering cannabis attorney. And I interviewed him for the story. And then at the end of the story, he was like, hey, by the way, did you know that like my daughter is also a cannabis columnist at LA Weekly and she went to Columbia Journalism School at the same time as you? And I was like, that's crazy. And I looked her up on Facebook and we had all these mutual friends and she lived in LA and I was like, oh my God, this is so weird. And so we
I
got
love
together,
that.
we had coffee and I was just like, wow, I feel like we're meant to know each other.
I love that. So how did you guys decide to do double blind together?
I mean, I had the idea for it, and then I called her and I was like, do you want to do this with me? And she was like, yeah.
I love that. She was just like, I'm in. Let's do it. So
Totally.
so did she switch from cannabis to psychedelics? Like, did she go from like cannabis to psychedelics more, or was she still kind of like holding space for both?
Yeah, she was writing about both. I mean, we both were writing about both, but then I think that when we switched to double blind, we just pretty much were writing about psychedelics. I mean, we made the intentional choice to not include cannabis in double blind simply because we felt like there were already a lot of media companies that were covering cannabis. Like there's
Mm,
Herb and Mary Jane and Civilized and High Times. And when we started double blind, there wasn't really like a publication that was trying to serve the mainstream public writing about psychedelics. So we're like, we're just going to focus on
this is our
the
thing then.
like content gap. Yeah.
Yeah, true. Uh, what would you say like are the double blind biggest readers? Would you say it's like educated people in psychedelics, or it's like kind of a mix of people that want to like learn more?
Yeah, it's definitely a mix. I mean, we have a survey on our website that asks people about that. So we get a lot of information, and basically it's split by a third. So we have one
Mm,
third of people who identify as psychedelic newbies, meaning that they've tripped before, but not that many times, and they want to go more deeply into it, or maybe they've never tripped before. We
mm,
have kind of experienced psychonauts, which would be people who have tripped more than a dozen times and really feel like psychedelics are an important part of their path. And then the third group would be people who are experienced psychonauts and who also either work in psychedelics or want to work in psychedelics. So a lot of people who want to become a psychedelic therapist or like a lawyer who wants to start practicing psychedelic law, people who basically are like, psychedelics have changed my life and I know that it's like a part of my professional path to start doing something with it.
that's really cool that you can like see that data. That's awesome. Like I would love to see. I don't know who. Well, I guess you can on Instagram. You can see men and women, but I would love to see like why people follow me for the reasons that they do.
I mean,
It's like
you can ask on your
yeah,
Instagram stories.
be like, are you my high school friend? Did you just see me on social media and think I was cool, or did we meet somewhere or something like that? I like to think about
Exactly.
those kinds of things. Did it feel natural to kind of start your own publication after being, on so many other ones?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always knew that I wanted to start a magazine or a media company, um, simply because I mean, it's kind of I kind of have the same path that a lot of entrepreneurs have, which is that I worked at a lot of businesses and I saw like things that I thought were being done well, and I saw things that I didn't think were being done so well, and I had an opportunity about 5 years before Double Blind to take over this media startup that I had been hired at. The
Mm,
founders wanted to step away, and I really thought deeply about it, and I was like, I'm gonna do this someday, but not now. Like I'm not ready. And I
mm,
went on and just like kept working and kept gaining experience. And by the time that I had the idea for Double Blind, I was like, okay. I was like, I know what we're up against. Like no one's figured out how to properly monetize media, and like
right.
a lot of startups fail, and I know it's going to be really hard, but like I'm as equipped as I'll ever be.
No, for sure. You just gotta jump in. You gotta try it out because, like, how do you know? Like, what are you gonna say? Like, I for sure know that I will mess this up. No, you don't. You never knows who's gonna be in it to help you. You know what I mean? I also saw that you got a billboard at Times Square. What goes into doing that? Do you have to like know somebody who knows somebody, or?
Yeah, so I have to give all the credit to Ronit and the other folks at Honeysuckle magazine, because
Mm,
we really didn't have much to do with the securing of the billboard itself.
mm,
Um, Ronit and her partner had done the first like CBD and cannabis billboards in Times Square, and they're based in New York. And I guess they just like know the billboard people, whoever the billboard
facts.
people are. and they they reached out to us because they wanted to do a campaign in psychedelics, and they just felt like they wanted to partner with someone who was familiar with the landscape. So basically they were like, you help us, kind of craft this narrative and we will get the billboard. Like, okay. But
Facts.
it was really hard actually, because what we learned is that every single billboard in Times Square is owned by a different company or person. So every single billboard has its own like crazy approval process, and you're not really allowed to say anything that's explicitly psychedelic. So we applied for so many different ones with different messaging and kept getting shut down. Like, we couldn't do shrooms, we couldn't show pictures of mushrooms, we couldn't use and then in the end we landed on celebrate plant medicine, which, if I'm being perfectly honest, isn't like the best slogan ever, but we were just like, it was just like a last ditch
Times
effort
Square.
to get it. It was a last ditch effort to get something up.
Yeah, I know. I totally, because I was looking at it too, and I was thinking the same thing. I was like, there's definitely more messaging that they could have put on the billboard to show it, but I was wondering if it had to do with censorship, obviously, because it's like Times Square. You know what I mean? If we're not going to put it on social media, are we going to put it in front of like those people? So I was just thinking, like, because I bet you guys could come up with some really cool graphics to like go up there. So I was thinking, but yeah, that is cool that I know a little bit more about that process, because I was thinking, I don't know, who owns the billboards? New York? I don't know. Like, that is cool. Like that it works like the same way that other places work, except it's a little bit more exclusive. Because like, how would you find out who owns that billboard versus this one? Where's the number? You know what I mean? Where would you look it
I
up? The
don't know,
billboard
man.
next to,
I don't
you know
have
what I
the
mean?
number.
That's
I
what
don't
I'm
have the
saying.
number.
Who does? That's like, it's like your dream is like you gotta like find the man who knows the guy who knows the guy. That's what I was. That's why I want to ask. But also I saw you got involved with like the Rolling Stone and Vice and Playboy. You could just go into one of those. But how did those opportunities kind of arise? Was it through Double Blind, or was it through you personally?
It was through Madison and I. Madison and I had already been reporting for all of these places before we started Double Blind, and so we just contacted our editors there and said like, "Hey, we started this thing, and do you want to collaborate?" For the record, we haven't collaborated with Vice, although they have covered some of our linked to some of our articles and stuff. But we did
Gotcha.
co-publish a long piece with Playboy, and we also have a column on Rolling Stone. And it's basically like that we have relationships with these editors. They know that we're good reporters. We're offering them free reported content in exchange for just like
The space.
a little acknowledgement at the top that we're like the
Hmm.
founders of this thing we care about. So it's kind of a win-win.
Very cool. So when you contribute to like these magazines, do you is because I'm a I wouldn't say, am I a new writer? Yes, I'm a new writer, and I'm looking, to put out my content and stuff like that. Is there a way for writers to just kind of find these publications and just kind of submit content to them, or is it like an email, like you got to know somebody and then kind of like go through that way about it?
Um, yeah, it's a good question. And I've actually given like lectures at universities to journalism students on how to get their bylines in various publications. And the sort of, yes, you do have to have the email address of a actual editor, probably. I mean, all these places do have, I'm sure, like a pitches at vice.com or submissions at something or other, Playboy. I don't know what the email address would be, but I'm sure they all have sort of like a general inquiry for writers thing. But as with all things in life, it's better to have a connection, because otherwise, a lot of stuff can get lost in the shuffle. But one way to do that, I mean, ideally, you can, ask someone that that's already contributed to one of these places for a reference. But if not, then it's not super hard to find email addresses of editors on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever. So that would definitely be my advice is, find an editor that is in control of the section that you want to write for, and try to get as specific as possible. Like if you're trying to write about drugs, then, you know, Vice, I'm sure has, I think they have drug editors specifically, but some other publications might only have a health editor, or if they're really small, they might only have like a science editor under which falls literally everything from like astronomy to mental health. So you just got to kind of do your best to find that right person, email them, put a compelling subject line in, and just be persistent. But once you cultivate a relationship with an editor and they like your work, it does become a lot easier because they know that they can count on you to deliver.
I appreciate that advice. That's really cool that you get to talk to all these places. What have you always had this kind of ease with public speaking, or would you say that you kind of like it kind of comes on?
I mean, I've always been relatively comfortable with public speaking, probably in part because I grew up singing on stages. Like I was like a little singer as a kid and talent shows and stuff like that. But I've done so many interviews and so much public speaking since starting DoubleBlind. I definitely think that it's become even easier for me. And it's like with all things, you know, practice
Sure.
makes things easier.
You're right. You're right. What does Double Blind Mag have coming up that you'd like to tell our listeners about?
Yeah, I mean, so there's kind of two aspects of DoubleBlind. There's our journalism, which is what we've mostly been talking about, which is our print magazine and our online articles. And we're coming out with issue 7 in July. It's our summer issue. It should be amazing. So if folks want to support us, they can go and subscribe or buy a copy of the magazine. We also have a whole other part of the business, which is our education, which includes courses on how to grow mushrooms, how to microdose, how to trip sit. So that's another way that you can sort of support us in our work, but also, you know, deepen your relationship with psychedelics if that's something that you feel called to do, is to sign up for one of our classes.
I love that. Thank you. Where do you see the psychedelics industry within the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's growing really fast. So typically, when people refer to the psychedelics industry, they're referring to drug development companies that are trying to take psychedelics through the FDA approval process.
Hmm.
And there are so many psychedelic drug development companies that are coming onto the scene all of the time. I feel like every day I get a press release that's like, so and so company in Canada is researching LSD for some random indication that you never thought LSD might be good for, like LSD for, trying to think of something random off the top of my head. I can't. And so there's definitely going to be more and more of that. The two compounds that will likely be legal in the next 5 years as prescription medications are MDMA and psilocybin. So as mentioned
Hmm.
before, psilocybin for major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression, and MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, to be determined whether, once those things become legalized, if people who do not have those indications will be able to access them and at what cost. Simultaneously, we are seeing the proliferation of ketamine clinics all across the country. So ketamine does tend to be expensive because, like MDMA would be if it was prescribed for something other than post-traumatic stress disorder, ketamine is being prescribed off-label for treatment-resistant depression, suicidality, anxiety, and a lot of other conditions. But that's just to say that it is becoming increasingly available for people who can afford it, and that's like a big contingency. We're also seeing a growing number of sort of churches or religious groups that are claiming that they're using psychedelics for religious reasons and saying that they're
Hmm.
protected by the First Amendment. Now, we don't really know what would happen if their claims to being used, you know, using these psychedelics under the First Amendment were to be challenged in court, if, you know, that would stand up. But we are seeing, you know, more and more groups claiming that. We're also seeing, of course, decriminalization spread and many jurisdictions following in the footsteps of Denver, Oakland, Santa Cruz, and other cities and counties. So there's just a lot happening. And, what's it all going to look like in 5 years? It's really hard to say, but I would anticipate that all these different routes to decrim and legalization are going to be further along than where they are now, and hopefully finding a way to work together.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back because you talked about post-traumatic stress disorder, and I saw that you also write extensively about like that in relation to like veteran PTSD. How can psychedelics help veterans with that?
Yeah, so the standard of care for veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder at VA hospitals is called prolonged exposure. And
Hmm.
it's a type of therapy that essentially involves talking about the thing that traumatized you over and over again until it doesn't traumatize you anymore. And it's been shown through MRIs that PE actually is really effective when people go all the way through the treatment. It can rewire the
Hmm.
way that the amygdala, the fight or flight part of the brain, processes fear. That
Hmm.
being said, PE does have a pretty high dropout rate because it's not very pleasant to just be talking over and over again about the thing that traumatized you. So we are in desperate need for, novel treatments for PTSD. And the thing about MDMA, it's not a classic psychedelic, it's an empathogen, but it does it does make it easier to revisit those traumatic memories. At least that's what the data is showing. And I can't remember what the percentage is off the top of my head, but a significant percentage of people who've gone through the MAPS MDMA trials have found that they no longer qualify for PTSD
Wow.
once they get through their sessions. So to me, you said psychedelics. There's many psychedelics that have shown promise for PTSD, including psilocybin and ayahuasca and ketamine. But if we're
Hmm.
talking specifically about MDMA, my understanding is that the way that that kind of, there's many mechanisms by which it works, but one of the ways in which it works is that it makes it easier for people to revisit and process traumatic memories so that they no longer have things like flashbacks and insomnia and anxiety, which just makes it really hard to live a normal life.
No, for sure. Like I can't imagine having flashbacks to it. Well, yes, I can, but like in a different way. Like I can't imagine like a veteran version of PTSD. Like that's why I'm not going in the army to begin with. So I don't know if I could mentally even handle that to begin with. So it is really cool to see that there is something that can help veterans achieve a better mindset. Um, because yeah, it sucks to go somewhere and be like, so the only thing that we can do is basically talk about it over and over and over again until you're cool with it, and then like that's it. Because when you were saying it to me, because in my head I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, but at the same time, it kind of makes sense in a way that like I've just seen so many people that are consistently like if they have like a bad home situation, like if something comes up, they're just not as sensitive to the subject anymore. It's almost as if like the repeat trauma has taught them to just kind of accept it. But I don't know that that's necessarily a good way to go about it. But also I'm not a doctor, so this is just like my thoughts. But it is interesting that we're like going into it because uh yeah, there's just so many mental things happening these days. First of all, like outside of the war, even like COVID mindsets, you know what I mean? I feel like there's so many people that were affected that don't necessarily connect it, or maybe they do and there's just not a lot to be done, and then so it's just like your thoughts. But I love that there's more mental health awareness and that there's more to be done for people that need it. It's really cool. I love seeing this stuff every day. I love talking about it, which is why I love doing this podcast. It's just like really cool that we can talk about these things because, these are conversations that I couldn't really, a time really couldn't talk to people about. It'd be taboo, right? They wouldn't understand what I'm talking about because there's not a lot of information out there that isn't just word of mouth. Oh, you take a tab and you're gonna be crazy, or you know what I mean. Here, look at this person who bit the corner off a tab. It's almost like when the parents are like, oh yeah, we walked 5 miles to school, there's this like same story of like this person bit off a sheet of acid and they went crazy and then we never talked to them again, or something like that. But I feel like outside of those stories, there needs to be information for people to like, understand their curiosities and be able to like look stuff up. And if the media is constantly censoring these things, then people are just going to try to find out themselves. And there's a lot of ways that we've seen within just like even reproductive stuff. That's what I want to talk about. The reproductive kind of, or the talks on reproduction that we're having right now kind of goes in that same, you know, if there's no information and we just say don't do it, then people are just not going to do it, right? No, it's just like the more information that people have about it, the safer they can be in order to do these things. It's like I saw somebody be like, you can die by skydiving, so just don't skydive. It's like that doesn't even make sense. Like it's a whole sport. There's safety measures, you know what I mean? There's things that you can do to make it safe. So why don't we just explore that and like get to the end and understand it versus just like staying in this spot and being like, no, we don't want to look it up. We already know what it is. We're not going to take any more time to look into it. We already know. But I like that. I like that you guys exist and that we're talking about it. That's my little rant over. I also saw that you did a panel on psychedelics and maternity. I was really interested to hear what kind of like things that you learned from them and that kind of experience as well.
Yeah, that was a wonderful panel. I was interviewing, I can't remember at the time, it was like 6 very powerful psychedelic facilitator, female mother goddesses. I mean, they were honestly all amazing.
I
And
love it.
we're going to be working with them hopefully on putting out a course on psychedelics, maternity, and parenthood, because one of the biggest content gaps that we see is mothers, parents, women wanting more information on how to use these medicines. And it's something that doctors and psychiatrists really are not willing to touch because of the liability. And we understand that. Going back to your point about if there's no information, people just won't be educated. We feel
Yeah.
like we feel like we need to address things that people want addressed. So the panel, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about using psychedelics while pregnant. We talked about using psychedelics during breastfeeding to help with postpartum depression. We even talked about taking psychedelics while giving birth. And I'll just, I feel like it's my responsibility to say, as a journalist, as someone who was trained to check all my facts and check all my data, that there's basically no research on whether it's safe for mothers to do psychedelics during, after pregnancy.
Right.
That being said, all I'll say is that all the women on the panel did it, and they're all wonderful, and their kids are all wonderful, and they had, they had a lot of legitimate things to say, I think, about the importance of, as a parent and as a mother, of tending to yourself, tending to your internal space, being in the right mindset, because, you know, postpartum depression is a huge issue. It's not something that we talk about very much in our society, but one of the points that one of the women made on the panel is like, yeah, if, as a mom, as a new mom, I'm having suicidal thoughts and I don't even want to get out of bed, then how do you expect me to take care of my newborn?
I'm saying because I've been talking so much about that, and I've been, because there's so many conversations about, you know what I mean, not just the joys of pregnancy but the things that happen afterwards, and like, motherhood and all that stuff. I'm like coming to understand all of these like things that happen to your body and to your mind afterwards. And it's almost like it makes me think more about that experience, right? It makes me think more about having a child. It makes me think more about what that means to be a mother and to go through that with your body. And you bring up like postpartum depression, and I'm a person that has depression, so I'm like thinking like I'm gonna get more depressed. Is that like that's like a like you know what I mean? That's just a given right after. So there's like a lot of things to think about, but that is interesting. I've never thought about psychedelics and pregnancy until I saw your post. So I really want to know like what goes into that, because I'm just someone that loves to see like different ways that people go about love, whether that's like different kinds of love, whether that's different kinds of birth. I don't know, I'm just interested in learning it all. I've seen like so many different kinds of birth methods. There's people that can like orgasm. There's like doulas for orgasming during birth. There's dolphin births I just heard about. It's not that I looked this up. It just comes up in my feed and I'm just like, wow, I now know that. Like, you know what I mean? But it sucks that there's no information for those pregnant people to just kind of like look over before they go into it, but they got to be the first sometimes, or you know what I mean, you got to be the first sometimes in these spaces in order for there to be information for people to look at. So that's really cool as well. I didn't even know that you were making like a book to help with that as well. I think that's, and people say like, oh, I don't have a book, there's no book for this. Yes, there is. Shelby has a book.
Well, it's actually going to be a course, not a book.
Oh
but
yes, of course.
stay
Well,
tuned.
even
Stay
better,
tuned.
even better. Like there's a class. There's a whole class. Like if the book wasn't reaching you, they got the class for it. So that's pretty cool. What's a recent life epiphany you've had, either with acid or without?
With acid specifically?
Oh shit, not just acid, but psychedelic. Sorry, I don't know,
Okay,
that word
because I
came to
was going
mind.
to say I haven't done acid in a minute. I don't
Yeah.
love acid just because it lasts for so freaking long. Hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think
Well, you were
about
talking
it.
earlier about how you are being in the nest now, and you're wanting to get out. Was that a recent thing, or is that just been your kind of plan?
I've been feeling like I've wanted to be nesting for a while now. Um, I mean, I did MDMA on Saturday, so I'm still kind of in the integration process with that.
Hmm.
Um, it's hard because I don't always walk away from psychedelic experiences with concrete revelations. And I think
Hmm.
that there's sort of a misunderstanding or false expectations that are sometimes put onto the experience. Like, you're going to go in with these questions and then you're just going to come out with the answers to all of your questions. And oftentimes when you're really deep in a psychedelic experience, it can be very somatic, meaning it can be very much like in your body, and there can be a shedding of emotions that you don't even necessarily understand. Or I mean, I did cry when I was on MDMA on Saturday, and it felt really good, but I didn't know what I was crying about. I literally still don't know.
That happens to me without any kind of drug interaction. I'll be like, "What the fuck is happening? Why am I okay?" No, but I see what you're saying too. So, sometimes when I go into like a psychedelic trip, I'm always trying to figure something out. I feel like there's like something I'm going into it with, but I'm also trying to keep like a good. I want to be in a good headspace. It's got to be something that I'm trying to figure out that's not necessarily going to make me, it's not like a depressing thing. Like I couldn't go into it like thinking like, so there's like a friend group situation type deal that would require like the thoughts of other people. But when I'm trying to think like, what are the next moves for myself, like an introspective type of like thing, I feel like maybe I can set the trip, because even when I'm thinking like, if I'm gonna smoke for this reason, sometimes that setting that intention kind of helps me as well. But I totally like, I'm sure, because I have an ADHD brain, that I could be going into something and then like come out of it with a completely different epiphany that I wasn't even like looking for, and you're just like, wow, okay, now I know that. Interesting. um
Hmm.
how do you feel about like cannabis and psychedelics at the same time? Do you feel like it brings you to uh a different I'm just trying to think, like, what do you feel about cannabis and taking psychedelics and cannabis together?
Well, for people who are curious about this topic, I would recommend that the article written by Michelle Janikian about smoking weed while tripping, simply because I could never put all the relevant information needed in just this interview. That being said, I'll say that, I mean, I love cannabis. I have a great relationship with cannabis. I do believe that for some inexplicable reason that the spirits of certain medicines vibe with more people than vibe with certain people. So like ayahuasca, mushrooms, and cannabis are kind of my medicines. Ketamine, Molly, LSD, like not so much. Hated 2CB, but maybe that was just the environment. That's just to say that, so for me, like cannabis tends to, just in general for everyone, cannabis tends to intensify the experience of a psychedelic. So if you are sort of peaking or you haven't peaked yet, then smoking cannabis might not be a great idea because it could intensify it. And, it's sort of like we say in psychedelics, start low and go slow, in the same way that you don't want to like take more acid or more mushrooms before you have waited long enough to see what the intensity of the experience is going to be. You might not want to smoke cannabis before you've like fully peaked on the psychedelic. A lot of people do like to use it kind of towards the end of the experience, but again, it can kind of send you into another whole wave of like visuals and distortion of space and time and stuff when you're coming down, and you might not want that. So I just say that like tread lightly. For me, I have had experiences because I'm an experienced cannabis user, and because typically it really helps put me into like a lighter and happier place. I have had experiences where I've taken a hit of weed and it's sort of like shifted me out of like a thought loop or something that was kind of headed in the direction of a bad trip, although we don't like to use that word at Double Blind. But yeah, I would just like caution for people to tread lightly with that.
Agree. I appreciate that information. My last question, as we're gearing down to the end of this podcast, again, thank you so much. Well, not again. I didn't even say it yet. Thank you so much for your time. It's been really awesome talking to you about this kind of stuff.
Sure.
I love that you have so much knowledge in it, and you're like constantly, you're like a psychonaut, but of this information. Well, you are a psychonaut as by nature, but also it's really cool that you've taken this in the passion of like writing, and you create content about it that people can learn from you and your experiences and other people's experiences, all in one place. So my last question for you is, what do you got going on next? What's any conventions, any cool things you got coming up?
Well, we are doing our first in-person event since the world shut down. We're having a music and art festival called Mycologia, which is going to be in the Cuyama Valley near Ojai in June. So that's
Mm.
going to be super dope. We're announcing our lineup tomorrow. We have a lot of really amazing DJs and bands that are going to be playing. So I'm excited for that. And otherwise, we're already doing so much at Double Blind between the print magazine and the articles and the courses and the webinars and the TikTok and the Twitter and the YouTube. Like, we're only a team of 5 people. So really,
Wow.
we're just want to keep doing what we're doing already, which is like a lot. It's all great. It's all great, but it's already a lot.
Understandable. Well, that's really cool that you got a 5-person team. Is it all women or is it like a mix?
Mostly women. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
We
We
have
love to
a
see
couple.
it.
We work with a few men, but only woke men.
That's what we like to see. Only woke men. Hell yeah. Well, Shelby, it has been awesome talking to you on the podcast. I'd love to talk to you more, like off podcast, about your experiences as well. But thank you so much for your time. I know you got a bunch of stuff to get to afterwards, so I really appreciate it. I'll say it again, and they'll say it again, and they'll say it again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much. I appreciate it as well, and I hope you have a nice day. Feel free to reach out.
I shall. And just
Okay.
so you know, this is Higher Women Podcast. This has been Shelby Hartman of Double Blind Magazine, and that's our show. Thank you so much for coming in.